In today's exclusive opportunity, you will hear from SPLC President and CEO Margaret Huang and former Attorney General Eric Holder about his new book, Our Unfinished March. I am so pleased to introduce you to the SPLC's President and CEO, Margaret Huang, an advocate for human rights and racial justice for nearly 3 decades. Margaret has championed social justice and human dignity, advocating an end to discrimination and oppression in all of its forms. Margaret hails from Tennessee and feels a strong connection to the South and our work here. She received a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University, a BSFS, Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. Margaret has given testimony before the U.S. Congress, United Nations human rights bodies, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. With her impressive background, we are thrilled to have Margaret leading our organization. Now, it is my pleasure to turn it over to SPLC President and CEO, Margaret Huang.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And what a pleasure and joy it is to be with all of you today for this extraordinary conversation. I had the chance to greet and welcome Mr. Holder just before this meeting, and we're both so excited about the opportunities to work together and collaborate on this important issue. So it's been energizing already to kick us off. We are so pleased to have the 82nd U.S. Attorney General as our featured guest. Eric Holder served as Attorney General during the Obama administration and was the first African American to hold that office. He is currently a partner and senior counsel with Covington and Burling, but most importantly, he serves as the chair of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, an organization much like the SPLC that is fighting to end gerrymandering and to protect the voting rights of all Americans. I'm delighted that he's also a fellow Columbia University alum, having attended as well the Columbia Law School. And today we're here to talk about his new book, co-written with New York Times bestselling author Sam Koppelman. This book was released in May. The book entitled Our Unfinished March, which is such a great way to kick off, the violent past and imperiled future of the vote, a history, a crisis, a plan, and that last part is the most important. The book chronicles deeply compelling stories of the brutal and yet many times hopeful history of voting in the United States. It includes frontline accounts of those battling the anti-democratic forces who would love nothing more than to strip away the fundamental right to vote, particularly from Black and Brown people. You will find that Our Finished March serves as a powerful playbook for how we can save our democracy before it's too late. And it's important to note that it's not too late. Here at the Southern Poverty Law Center, we are still marching forward. In the last year, we've committed more than $100 million to the next 10 years supporting community organizations in our deep Southern states through the Vote Your Voice program, empowering them to pursue greater voter participation and equitable representation throughout the Deep South. And through SPLC's Our Future, Our Vote grassroots campaign, we're educating and galvanizing communities in the South that have been adversely affected. I'm so excited to see how the collective work of so many organizations like ours are helping to drive people to the polls in unprecedented numbers. In fact, I'm excited to share with you that in Georgia, more than 1 million people have already cast their votes. That's 23% more than in the 2018 election, which makes Mr. Holder's book so timely. It resonates with so many of us as we continue the long, hard work of protecting the fundamental right to vote. So let's dive in. And Eric, thank you again for being with us today.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to a great conversation. The SPLC is an organization, as we were talking about before, that has done a great deal of work, really positive things over the years. And a lot of the things that we've tried to do at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee are laid on top of the great work that this organization has done, for many, many decades. So I'm glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Now, just a reminder, we are going to have a chance for all of you to ask questions. And when we come to that, I'll ask you to come off mute and introduce yourselves. But in the meantime, I have a few questions to kick us off. So Eric, in the book, Our Unfinished March, you depict the United States as a fragile, fledgling democracy whose citizens have only had access to the ballot, full access, since the 1960s. So many, many years after the founding of the country. Take us through a few of the stories that you reference in the book about how the vote was won here, first by white men, then by white women, and finally by African Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting tale. The book is broken up into three parts. There's a historical section that kind of traces the history of the acquisition of the vote. The middle part is about kind of where we are today. And the third part deals with some practical and I think obtainable solutions to the problems that we are now confronting. But if you look at the history of the vote in this country, it's always been about groups trying to get access to the franchise. And I think a lot of people have been surprised by the first part of the book when they come to see that the first group of people to try to get access to the vote were white men who didn't have property. The way in which things were set up at the beginning stages of our country, white men were the only ones who could vote, and white men who didn't have property were excluded from the ballot. It's estimated that with regard to George Washington, if you look at all the people who could vote now, categories of people who could vote now, only 6% of the people, eligible people by modern day standards, actually cast a ballot or were able to cast a ballot in that first presidential election. And so white men got together and rally to demand that they have the right to vote. That is, white men without property. And we talk about a couple guys, Thomas Dorr and Seth Luther, who led a rebellion in Rhode Island to come up with a new state constitution so that people without property, white men without property, would have the right to vote. We then move on to, and in the Constitutional Convention, there were concerns about this, and some of the founding fathers said, well, if you give white men without property the ability to vote, we're not sure that they have the intellectual capacity. They will be able to be bought off if they don't have property. And beyond that, if you give this group of people the right to vote, other groups of people will ask for the right to vote. And one of the founding fathers says, well, women will even ask for the right to vote. Oh, horrors. And so we then trace how women organize and try to successfully get the right to vote. One of the people who really impressed me is a young woman named Alice Paul, who consistently marches for the acquisition of the right to vote for women. In 1913, she is in a march that women had in Washington, D.C., right down Pennsylvania Avenue, and they were actually beaten as a result of this march. She was ultimately put in jail, and along with other women, they went on a hunger strike. They were then force-fed. She then comes out of that, and stations herself outside the White House until Woodrow Wilson ultimately says he's going to support the bill in Congress that would give women the right to vote. And then ultimately it was ratified by the states. And so, talking about these individuals who imagined an America that they had never actually lived in is something that I thought was important, not only to understand our history, but also to give us a sense of hope in the present day. We are trying to imagine in present day America, an America that in fact has never really existed, a true multiracial functioning democracy. And in given the ability that others have had, other generations have had to do exactly that, I think it's up to this generation to replicate, the successes that prior generations had.
I loved the story about Alice Paul. And I will tell you that some of the other stories you shared, including ones about Ida B. Wells and Albert Turner, they also really highlighted some amazing individual stories about the work that they were doing. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the people today that we should be watching, who are giving you hope, who are making that change happen today? I know you feature a few folks in your book.
Yeah. One is a guy named Chris Holland. He's actually running for mayor of Houston now, but he was tasked with the responsibility of coming up with somebody to run the election system in Harris County, where that's Houston, which is the largest county, I think, in the country. Come up with somebody to run the electoral system for the 2020 election. And he cast about, he's a very bright young guy, great educational background, McKinsey company. I mean, he's a young star, and couldn't get anybody who wanted to do the job. So he decided, well, maybe I should do the job myself. And people told him, wait a minute, if you want to have, a political future, you don't want to run, you don't want to be the person in charge of running the election in 2020. Undaunted, he said, well, nobody else wants to do it. I have some ideas. And so he decided to take the job. And as a result of what he did, he came up with a whole range of things that increased turnout in Harris County to record levels. Drop boxes, voting 24/7, the ability of people to cast votes at 1, 2 in the morning, so they didn't have to choose between their jobs and their ability to cast a vote. People who have different work schedules. He came up with a whole range of things. He really encouraged mail-in voting, all without any indication of fraud or any indication that things were not done appropriately. And so Chris Holland is one of the people that I talk about. And he did all of this stuff. I mean, we have to remember also, he increased turnout to record levels in the middle of a pandemic. He had more people cast a ballot that presidential election in 2020 in a pandemic than has ever occurred before. One of the other people we talk about is a young woman named Love Caesar, a student at North Carolina A&T, which is the largest HBCU in the country. She gets up one morning with a piece of chalk and draws a line right down the middle of the campus at North Carolina A&T. Students get up the next day and see this line of chalk and figure, well, what's this all about? She explains to people that the Republicans in North Carolina had actually drawn a line right where she drew it with chalk, right down the middle of the campus of HBCU when it came for redistricting purposes, to actually split that HBCU, North Carolina A&T, into 2 different parts. Therefore, thereby weakening the power of those students. They were in 2 separate congressional districts. One student, I remember we talked to her, she said, well, I wake up in this dorm, I go to school in this district, I go to a class in another district. If I switch dorms, if I go from this dorm to another dorm, I move congressional districts. Love Caesar really got people at the school to focus on this problem of redistricting. They got in touch with us at the NDRC. We filed a lawsuit on their behalf, which ultimately resulted in the court system in North Carolina ruling that the gerrymandered congressional map was in fact unconstitutional, that it violated the North Carolina Constitution. And that is the precursor to the case that is now before the Supreme Court, with the Republicans in North Carolina saying that you're trying to push this fringe doctrine, this independent state legislature doctrine. This is one of the 2 big voting cases that the Supreme Court will hear argument on. This case will be heard by the Supreme Court on December the 7th, but it all goes back to that HBCU, North Carolina A&T, and Love Caesar and a piece of chalk. But Love Caesar and Chris Holland, 2 young people who decided to get involved, to come up with really kind of different, unique ways of trying to make the system better, and who demonstrated the power of what an individual can do, both in Texas and in North Carolina. And what they did has national collateral impacts.
Those are fantastic stories. Thanks so much, Eric. I want to read a quote now from the book and ask you to talk a little bit more about the impact of gerrymandering and minority rule. Here's the quote. We're living through the implementation of a kind of political apartheid, where Republicans are perpetually in control of what does and doesn't become law, even when they win fewer votes than Democrats at every level.
Yeah, I mean, people, we were talking about this before, when we formed up the National Democratic Redistricting Committee back in 2017, and I'd go out and say, all right, I'm here to talk about gerrymandering and redistricting, and you can see people's eyes glaze over and like, oh my God, what, people thinking this is too, it's too wonky, too ephemeral. What does this mean? And so making people understand that redistricting has an impact on people's day-to-day lives, questions about reproductive rights, protecting the right to vote, criminal justice reform, climate, all those things are related ultimately to redistricting. And so what we have seen is that the Republicans have made peace with the notion that they are potentially going to be a minority party in terms of popular support. They've made peace with that as long as they have and continue to have majority power. So they don't necessarily think that there has to be a connection between popular support and majority power. I'm going to Wisconsin later this afternoon, and that's a really stark example of that. If you look at the way in which the Wisconsin Assembly is constructed, for Democrats to win the majority of the seats in the Wisconsin Assembly, they have to win 56% of the vote. Republicans, by contrast, can gain can actually get control of the Wisconsin legislature by winning 44% of the vote, and that's all as a result of gerrymandering. And in gerrymandered districts, you're not worried about a general election. You're worried about a primary. You're in a safe seat. And in that safe seat, you don't want to cooperate with the people across the aisle, because that's seen as a sign of weakness and invites a primary challenger. And as a result, we don't see progress where we have huge amounts of gerrymandering. We have one-party rule that can be inconsistent with the desires of the people who are resident in those states. I mean, if you look across the country, state by state, there is not one state where the majority of the people said that they wanted Roe versus Wade overturned. Now, the margins are different, say in Texas as opposed to New York State. And yet, because of gerrymandering, you can see these Republican-led state legislatures putting in place these really draconian anti-choice laws, again, inconsistent with the desires of the people in those states. But they can do this understanding that because they are in these safe gerrymandered seats, they will suffer no electoral consequence for doing things, again, inconsistent with the desires of their constituents. And you see that on a whole range of issues, gun safety laws. When it comes to, in Florida, this notion of re-enfranchising felons, people formerly incarcerated. Again, do things inconsistent with the desires of the people, and yet, because of gerrymandering, they remain in safe seats. And so gerrymandering allows for a minority, almost like I said, a political apartheid system, but for a minority to control, the fate, the direction of the nation.
Oh, lots of good food for thought there. Thank you, Eric. I want to ask one more question, but I'm going to invite our guests to consider submitting a question after your next answer, and so we can involve some more people in the conversation. Okay, so Eric, my last question for you is, I want to talk about voter fraud. According to the Brennan Center, they've done a recent investigation, and they have stated that there is a greater chance of being struck by lightning than actually someone committing in-person voter fraud. So my question for you is, why is this narrative persisting? Why do we hear so many reports and challenges about voter fraud when it is in fact such a complete non-existent problem?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good question. And, we talk about that in the book, and it's just a part of the big lie. I mean, this notion of voter fraud, this notion of illegitimate elections, the notion that elections were somehow rigged, all of these things get repeated over and over and over again. And after a while, a certain number of people start to think, simply because they've heard it a lot, don't necessarily see any proof of it, but because they've heard it a lot, they tend to think that, well, there must be something to it. We always want to be careful about involving Nazis in comparisons, but we talk about Joseph Goebbels and this notion of the big lie. And the bigger the lie, more people will say, well, wait a minute, I mean, that's so big, so outrageous. I mean, there must be some truth to that. But that drumbeat of of voter fraud, that notion that people are somehow stuffing ballot boxes, or that people, the dead people are voting. Again, as the Brennan Center says, totally inconsistent with the facts, is something that has seeped into the consciousness of a great many people in this country, and certainly enough people so that in these gerrymandered districts, Republicans have the ability to put in place these really unnecessary and oftentimes draconian anti-democracy measures that make it more difficult for certain people to vote. It's why you see this one of the reasons why you've seen this huge push for photo ID. You have to have a photo ID in order to cast a vote. Now, I'm certainly a person who says, I prosecuted election fraud cases when I was a young lawyer at the Justice Department. And I'm certainly a person who says, we should not have voter fraud. You ought to prove, who you are in order to cast a vote. But we've always had the ability to do that before this latest wave of photo IDs by a whole range of, methods. So you rent receipts. I mean, there's a whole range of ways in which you can prove, who you are. But Republicans have put in place these unnecessary photo ID laws. And I'll give you just one quick example of what they've done with that. In Texas, if you have a photo ID that says you have the ability to carry a weapon, carry a gun, get a photo ID issued by the state, you can use that to prove who you are and then cast a ballot. If you're a student at the University of Texas and you have a photo ID issued by the state that says, I'm a student here at the University of Texas, I'm resident here in Texas, that's not acceptable. That is not an adequate ID. And so think about the judgment that the state legislature has made there and who they want to have vote. People who carry guns as opposed to young people at the University of Texas. They've made a value judgment, an assessment of what the political leanings of those two groups are. And they want to make it more difficult for one of those two groups, the progressive leaning, the democratic leaning, young students, try to keep them or make it more difficult for them to get to the polls. And these elections are so close that you don't have to keep a whole group of people away from the polls. You just need to shave the number of people in that group down 1%, 2%, 3%, and that can be decisive in these very close elections that we have seen and that I suspect we're going to continue to see in the immediate future.
I remember, Eric, learning that after the Shelby v. Holder case, which I'll ask you about in a moment, that the state of Alabama immediately put into force its law requiring a photo ID, and then took the decision to close the state offices that provide voter IDs in 9 districts, where it happened to be primarily African-American voters and some of the poorest people in the state who suddenly could not get access to a voter ID in their local counties. So the thought and strategy going into the denial of vote is really quite overwhelming at times. And it gives us a lot of food for thought. So I'm going to invite folks. Again, you're welcome to put a question in the chat for Mr. Holder. You're welcome to come off mute, introduce yourself, and ask a question. But I wanted to ask you about the Shelby versus Holder case. You actually talk very movingly about what it was like as a young lawyer to go to the Supreme Court, to file that first brief when you were just a baby lawyer, as my staff likes to call it, and then to have your name in the case that actually has stripped away some of our most fundamental rights. Tell us a little bit about your own experience of that case and tell us about the silent protests that you waged.
Yeah, it's the Shelby County versus Holder case. I am the holder that was mentioned in that I think just awful decision in 2013. And friends of mine, and you are now a friend of mine, will never refer to that case again as the Shelby versus Holder case. That's the simple. I just call that the Shelby County case. It's kind of like you don't want, like Dred Scott versus Holder. You don't want your name associated with an opinion, an odious opinion like that. But the Shelby County case, it really blew a hole in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In spite of the fact that Congress had gone through extensive hearings, had huge numbers of witnesses, huge numbers of exhibits, did a great report to say that the Voting Rights Act needed to be reauthorized. It was signed by President George W. Bush. Every reauthorization, it's interesting, every reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed by a Republican president. Supreme Court, led by the Chief Justice, his famous phrase is, "America has changed." And the court did its own kind of fact-finding and made determinations that America had changed sufficiently such that the coverage formula in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was outdated, that progress had been made, and therefore that portion of the Voting Rights Act was deemed unconstitutional, which took away from the Justice Department the ability to use a power called preclearance. In covered states, you had to come to the Justice Department if you wanted to make changes with regard to the location of polling places, closing polling places, voter purges, a whole range of things. Supreme Court said, no, not going to have the Justice Department in as part of the mix. And as a result of that case, you saw almost immediately a range of states using this new power that they had, or this lack of supervision that they now enjoyed, closing polling places, 1,700 polling places at last count since the Shelby County decision, primarily, disproportionately in communities of color. Voter purges gone up by 40%. Again, disproportionately in communities of color, and a whole range of things done to make it more difficult for people to vote. One of the things that an attorney general always does, as I say in the book, is they find the easiest case that's on the docket and let the attorney general, you put on your morning coat and you go up there and you argue a case. After the Shelby County decision, because I was going to wait until the second term to do my argument before the court, after the Shelby County case in 2013, I said, you know what? I'm not going to go to this court. I'm going to break with tradition. I'm not going to argue a case up there and pretend that this is simply business as usual, that a case that bears my name and that has really destroyed a significant portion of the crown jewel of the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'm not going to just go up there and look at those 5 justices and pretend that they have not done something, I think, to grievously harm our democracy. And so my silent protest was that I talk about it in the book for the first time, was the decision not to go up there and argue a case. And again, as I said, it's always pick the easiest case, the one that the AG, however inept he or she might be, can't possibly lose. But I decided that I would break with that tradition, and for that reason, and certain people within the Justice Department knew that, the SG's, the Solicitor General's office, folks there knew it, and they were kind of aghast at the notion that I was going to break with this tradition. But I said, no, I'm not wound that way. I'm not going to be able to look at the Chief Justice and those 4 other justices, and again pretend that that this is something, that it's business as usual. And so that's why I decided not to argue a case.
I'm so glad that you shared that in the book. I think it's really important that people understand the implications of that decision for our entire country and for the future of our democracy. And one of the things I enjoyed most was reading your chapter about the reforms that are needed in the judiciary, and particularly regarding the Supreme Court. Could you talk a little bit more about that particular chapter, Eric?
Sure. Yeah, there's some really, as I said, some really concrete proposals with regard to changes I think we need to make to our structural changes that we need to make that will enhance our democracy. Among them, we went through each branch, what presidency, the executive branch, the legislative branch, Congress, and then finally the Supreme Court. And with regard to the Supreme Court, I said, first off, we need to have term limits. We can't have people who serve in these unelected positions for 30 and 40 years. That's too much power given to somebody in an unelected position. As we trace in the book, most people who had life tenure, justices have always had life tenure, but most people who served on the Supreme Court in the early years of the nation, and actually, up until maybe the 20th century or so, left the court because they died. They just died, and then a president would appoint somebody to take the place of that deceased justice. Now, with longer lifespans, people on the court, justices on the court, have these things that I call strategic retirements. They quit only when a president of their ideological leaning will be the person who has the ability to choose their replacement. Now, that's certainly what Justice Kennedy did, but to be fair, that's also what Justice Breyer did as well. And so I would say, all right, first off, we want to have 18-year terms instead of life tenure. This is one of these rare instances, and this is in the book as well, where the Chief Justice actually agrees with me. He gave a speech where he said that he thinks Supreme Court justices should serve 15 years. I say 18 years because if you meld it with another of the proposals, you'll end up with a Supreme Court that will stay at 9 seats. Because the other part of the proposal is that a president announce or be able to appoint a justice to the Supreme Court in the first and third years of his or her term. So first year of a term, you appoint a justice. Third year of a term, you appoint a justice. And in that way, if they serve 18 years, over time, the court will get back to 9 justices. In the short term, it will mean an expansion of the court, something that I also think should occur given the way in which the last 2 Supreme Court seats were filled. Merrick Garland was denied an opportunity at a hearing and was not put on the court, even though that occurred, that nomination occurred about 11 months or so before the election. Mitch McConnell said, too close to an election, can't have a hearing. And then when Justice Ginsburg dies, Amy Coney Barrett is put on the court while people are actually voting. And so those 2 seats, I think, have been, for lack of a better term, stolen. And I think the court needs to be expanded at a minimum to deal with those 2 stolen seats. But I also think, as I said, if you do that first and third year term, that will expand the court. But ultimately, will get us back to a 9-member court.
Really helpful. Thank you, Eric. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to come off mute and introduce yourself, or you can submit it in the chat. Eric, you also had, as you noted, recommendations for Congress and what Congress could do. And I'd wonder if you could particularly talk about the challenge of filibustering, which has been particularly difficult in this last congressional session to move pieces of legislation, even with a majority of Democrats in both houses.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the filibuster is a real impediment to progress. If you look at the number of times the filibuster has been used, it has really exploded over the course of the last decade. Now, people seem to think that you're supposed to have 60 votes in order to pass, get something through the Senate. And that's not true. I mean, you're only supposed to have we talk about it in the book. The founding fathers said that, given their experiences with the Articles of Confederation and the need to move legislation, this notion of having supermajorities or anything more than 50% was something that they talked about and rejected. Well, the filibuster, is a relatively recent vintage, comes up in the 19th century, not used particularly huge number of times, used interestingly to try to stop civil rights bills, but never really kind of filtered out into the general use that we now see. But now we have because of the filibuster, you can have 41 senators stop anything from getting through through the Senate. And the filibuster is now done in a different way. We think of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Jimmy Stewart standing up there for like 20 hours or whatever it was, and he's filibustering, he's holding the floor. Now a filibuster means you just have somebody on your staff call some clerk at the in the Senate and say, I'm going to filibuster this bill. We never even know who the person is who's filibustering the bill. It is done, as I said, as a matter of routine. And it's interesting, if you look at the way you have to defeat a filibuster now is to get 60 votes. So if you could get 41 senators to ultimately go with a filibuster that can frustrate the majority. And if you look at the way in which we have, because of the Great Compromise, 2 senators per state, you can have 41 senators that represent roughly 20% of the population of this nation would have or do have the ability to stop legislation that might be passed by the House and is generally supported by people in the country. But those 41 senators, again, represent roughly 20% of the population, can effectively stop things from getting through. And so ending the filibuster is one of the proposals that is in the book with regard to legislative reforms. That is, the widespread use of the filibuster has turned the Senate into to get things through the Senate. You need super majorities, and again, something considered by the founding fathers, but rejected.
Eric, tell us about the work that you're currently doing with the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. You mentioned you're heading to Wisconsin next. What are some of the cases or issues that you're really lifting up through this organization?
Yeah, the NDRC was formed up in January of 2017 to try to make the redistricting process that we were going to go through in 2021, just more fair. President Obama and I both decided that this would be our chief political involvement in our post-public lives. And he's been a great partner in this effort. And what we said from the beginning is that we simply want to make the system fair. I didn't want to gerrymander for Democrats. I've stood against Democrats who tried to gerrymander, Democrats in Maryland, Democrats in New York, stood against those efforts because what I've consistently said, and I think it's right, if the system is fair, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. That's all we need. Now, so we have brought successfully brought lawsuits in a variety of places and really kind of knocked down gerrymanders in Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, had successful lawsuits in Ohio, but Republicans ignored what the Supreme Court, their state Supreme Court said had to occur. And so that's ongoing in litigation. We have supported the putting in place of these independent commissions to draw the line, to take the power away from these interested state legislatures and have these neutral commissions actually draw the lines. And that has occurred in places like Virginia. It didn't work particularly well, but it's got at least the concept has taken hold there. It needs to be made better. Michigan, that worked quite well. We got one also passed in Utah as well as in Missouri, but then Republicans tinkered with it and made those commissions not as effective as they might have been. One in Colorado as well, and they exist already in Arizona and in California. And I like that idea of taking it out of the hands, as I said, of interested legislators and having a neutral body actually draw the lines in a fair way. And the other thing that we really focused on is supporting candidates who will stand for a fair electoral system, a fair redistricting process. We call these people democracy defenders, and I'm going to be going to Wisconsin and then Arizona to campaign for some of those people. And these are people at the state level. This is where the NDRC really lives. People get all excited about who's going to be president. Obviously, we should. Who's going to be running for the Senate? People don't understand that on a day-to-day basis, our lives are probably more impacted by who serves in our state legislatures as opposed to who serves in Washington, D.C. And so I'll be out there campaigning for these democracy defenders. I'll be finishing up in Wisconsin and in Arizona. I've been in a number of states before that and doing a lot of things virtually.
That's great. We do have a question in the chat. Thank you, Corey Ward. Why was it important for you to write Our Unfinished March at this particular moment. The timing of this feels incredibly on point, but I'd love for, I mean, you finished it a year ago. So what were you thinking about why this book was needed right now?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There's both a personal component to it and a democracy component to it. The personal one is that I'm working on a memoir with this same publisher that is now, I guess, 5 years overdue. And my editor, great guy, Chris said, you got to give us a book, Eric. How about this? Why not write something about democracy, about voting? And we sat down and thought, given what's happened in the country in the post-Trump years, yeah, let's write a book about voting. I have to add that chapter about democracy at the beginning. So that was on the personal side. When it comes to democracy itself, I thought that putting together a book that traced the history of the fight for the vote, a description of kind of what it is we're facing now, and then with some concrete proposals about how we can structurally make our nation more fair, more small d democratic. That this would be a good book, to have out there, and for people to have the ability to reference, and maybe something that would spur changes. And it really it's one of those books that I think kind of just met the moment. I think we anticipated that things were going to, get bad, deteriorate. I'm not sure I expected they would deteriorate this much, or that the situation would get this bad. But almost everything that we're grappling with now is examined in the book, either in terms of the proposals that are made, descriptions about some of the actors who were players in the problems that we are now confronting, or the historical part of the book, where you get an understanding of where these present day problems come from. So it's it's a book that, as I said, I think has met the moment. It's one that I think people will find accessible. It's not written as a law review article that only lawyers can would want to read. It's something that I'm proud of, and I think has done fairly well. And so I would hope that all of you will have the ability to look at it, comment upon it, and maybe share with your friends.
That's great. And maybe my last question for you, Eric. You talk a lot about hope for our country, and you find sources of hope throughout the various stories that you share in the book. What's your advice for all of us sitting here today on what we as citizens of this country can do to protect our democracy? What are some of the things from the book or from your other experiences in the last few years that continue to give you hope when you see folks around the country taking up this challenge to stand up for our country?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the book at the end of the day is a pretty it's an optimistic book because, and my optimism comes from the fact that, previous generations of Americans faced challenges in their day, successfully overcame those challenges, and put us on that path towards this more fair and more just America. Not linear progress. I mean, there have been setbacks along the way, but I don't think that this generation of Americans will fail where others were successful. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But here's the deal. It doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people like us put our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And so what I would urge everybody here to think about is that what is it that you can do to put your hand on that arc and pull it towards justice? That means supporting, candidates like I'm going to in Wisconsin and Arizona, and I've done in Michigan, Pennsylvania previously. These democracy defenders, support candidates, work in their campaigns, contribute to them, knock on doors for them. That's one way. But then also be involved in the civic life of our nation. I think we've gotten away from that, and we don't understand that we have an obligation as citizens of this country. I've had a number of titles. I've been a judge, I've been a deputy attorney general, I've been attorney general, but I have the most important title right now in my life, and that is citizen Eric Holder. And as a citizen, I have responsibilities, and that means being involved in the civic life of the nation. being a part of organizations and supporting organizations like the SPLC that is trying to perfect this democracy of ours. Serving on boards, being part of organizations, and then also interacting with young people and trying to get them engaged with and focused on our civic life and on politics. Because the reality, politics at its best is all about the future. And so young people have maybe in some ways, the greatest stake in these debates that we have that are ongoing. I'm still pretty vibrant. I think of myself still as this young guy, but the reality is I have more yesterdays than I have tomorrows. These elections are more about my kids than they are about me. And so you all engaging, coming up with ways in which you engage with young people and making them, light that fire in them to get involved in the way that Chris Hollins did, the way that Love Caesar did, the way that Alice Paul did, that Thomas Dorr did, all these great heroes that some of their names have been lost to us in history, but these great heroes, these small people, these so-called, regular, ordinary citizens who do extraordinary things. All of us have that capacity within us to take that arc and bend it towards justice. And so that's why I would urge, all of you to do. The fact that you are supporting the SPLC is by itself something that is unbelievably significant. But I would ask you maybe to dig down and ask yourself, what else is it that I can do? Certainly make sure that you can continue to support SPLC. This is one of those, foundational organizations. It's upon which the work of the SPLC is upon which we built, great success, especially, in the South. But think about other ways in which you can bend that arc and pull it towards justice. We can do this. We can do this.
Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel completely fired up hearing that. And Eric, I felt the same way reading your book. So wonderful. The book is up again. And I know that you're all going to be excited to finish reading if you haven't, or to share it if you have finished reading with your friends and family. It's an extraordinarily inspiring effort. One thing I wanted to know about the title of the book. We at the Southern Poverty Law Center talk all the time about how the march continues. We are merely on a journey. We are not unfinished yet in terms of where we need to go. And I want to flag for all of you that we are actually organizing a weekend of both celebration and learning at the 2023 celebration of the Selma to Montgomery March, the Jubilee celebration that will be held the first weekend of March in 2023. We're going to be bringing our allies and supporters and donors together so that we can reiterate that we are committed to continuing to move this march forward. And I hope many of you will consider joining us in person in Alabama, in Selma and Montgomery for that weekend. Eric, this has been a true honor and a pleasure for me. Thank you so much for making the time, especially in this very busy build up to the midterm elections. This book is extraordinary, and I'm so grateful to be able to share it with all of our supporters. Thank you very much for making the time today.
All right, well, thanks for having me. And again, continued support for the SPLC. Great organization. Continue supporting them.